Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking into some material that deals with a pretty sensitive topic.
Right. It's all about the impact of Indian immigration on Western countries, places like Australia, Canada, the UK, the US.
Exactly. And the sources we have present some, let's say, strong viewpoints.
Definitely. It's quite charged material in places.
So, just to be clear up front, our job here isn't to agree or disagree. We're here to unpack the arguments being made in these sources.
Understand the core claims, particularly around the economy and cultural changes. That's the focus.
Okay, let's get into it then. The first big theme that comes up is this idea that Indian immigration is, well, shaking up local job markets.
Yeah, disrupting them is the term used. And a key example given is the H-1B visa situation in the U.S.
Right. The stat they use is pretty striking. Something like 75% of those visas going to Indian workers.
That's the number cited in the material. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the argument presented is that this is basically a way for companies to get, well, cheaper labor.
It does make you think, though, what's the other side? Why are those visas seen as necessary in the first place? Is it purely about cost, or is it more to it?
That's a fair question, though the source material really focuses on that cost-saving angle. It also brings up the Canadian trucking industry.
Ah, yes. Claiming it's now dominated by Indian drivers who are supposedly willing to work for less.
That's the assertion, that it's driving down wages and making it harder for, local truckers.
Which leads into this concept the source calls corporate complicity.
Right. The idea that big businesses are actively involved, lobbying governments for more visas, maybe even setting up hiring practices that favor immigrant workers because it saves them money.
It paints a picture of economic incentives really driving these immigration patterns, at least according to this perspective.
It does. And there's a specific story they include, an anecdote.
Oh, the IT worker one. That was quite something.
Yeah, an American IT worker who apparently had to train their replacement. An Indian worker paid significantly less just before being laid off.
Wow. I mean, hearing stories like that, you really feel for the person involved. It definitely makes the source's argument very vivid.
It absolutely does. And it connects to another point they raise, temporary workers who actually end up staying long term.
How so? What's the mechanism they claim is being used?
Well, they talk about potential loopholes, like using student visas, maybe enrolling in less rigorous institutions, purely as a way to get into the country and then find ways to stay.
So, not necessarily genuine students in all cases, according to this view.
That's the implication. And tied to that is the issue of asylum claims. This is quite a serious allegation.
What specifically do they allege?
The source claims some immigrants are making fraudulent asylum claims, using things like fake persecution based on, say, religious intolerance back in India as a pretext to gain residency.
Okay, that's a very strong claim. And again, important to stress this is coming directly from the source material we're looking at.
Absolutely crucial to remember. These are the arguments within the sources.
Right. So moving on from the economic side, the second major theme is culture. The argument that this scale of immigration is causing a big cultural shift.
Yes, and they use this phrase, multiculturalism becoming monoculturalism.
Which sounds a bit paradoxical. What do they mean by that?
I think the concern being expressed is that instead of a blend of many cultures coexisting, certain areas are becoming dominated by just one non-native culture.
And they give examples.
They do. Brampton in Canada is cited. Apparently it's around 50% South Asian now, and the source mentions it's sometimes called Browntown.
Okay. That's a significant demographic concentration.
And similarly, Harris Park in Sydney, Australia, described as overwhelmingly Indian, to the point where some long-term residents allegedly feel like foreigners in their own area.
These examples definitely point to rapid demographic change in specific places. But the sources go beyond just numbers, don't they? They talk about cultural practices.
Exactly. Concerns are raised about things like amplified prayers from temples causing disturbances in neighborhoods, and also discussions around school calendars, a perceived push for Hindu or Indian holidays, while the source claims Christian traditions might be fading or getting less emphasis.
There's even a quote from a UK councillor, isn't there, contrasting?
Yeah, contrasting traditional village faiths with the rise of Bollywood nights and cricket matches. It's presented as a symbol of this cultural shift.
So it's about the public expression of culture changing.
And also about deeper social norms. The source brings up the alleged importation of the caste system.
Right, claiming that Dalits, those formerly known as untouchables, face discrimination even in places like Silicon Valley, brought over from India.
It's a concerning claim, and there's also mention of a potential clash between what are described as more conservative Indian views on women and Western feminism.
Did they quote an Australian feminist?
Yes, an activist worried about Indian values influencing how women dress or perhaps behave, suggesting a tension with local feminist progress. These are obviously complex social dynamics being highlighted.
Okay, so we've covered the economic arguments and the cultural shift arguments as laid out in the source material. What's next? The idea that this might be intentional.
Sort of. The third segment explores the reasons behind these trends and the reactions they're supposedly causing. It touches on this idea of government and corporate collusion.
Collusion? How so?
Well, they point to things like Canada's official immigration targets aiming for 500,000 immigrants a year, with India being a major source country.
And connecting that to corporate interests.
Yes, alleging that big tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, are named actively lobby for policies that allow them to bring in more Indian workers, presumably for cost or skill reasons.
And wasn't there a whistleblower account mentioned too?
There was, yeah. Supposedly from someone inside an Indian recruitment agency.
What did they claim?
They claim they were told directly to prioritize Indian candidates over local ones, specifically because they were cheaper to hire. If true, that would certainly suggest a deliberate strategy, at least in that instance.
Okay, so if that's the perceived cause, what about the effect or the reaction?
The source talks about a backlash brewing.
Meaning, like political movements.
Exactly. It points to the rise of certain right-wing or nationalist movements. Examples given include the Enough is Enough protests in Australia and the growing support for the Reform Party in the UK.
Suggesting these are, partly, a response to immigration levels and the perceived cultural changes.
That seems to be the link the source is making. And it also mentions, disturbingly, actual incidents of tension and violence.
Thus says.
Clashes reported between Hindu and Sikh groups in Canada, for instance, and also attacks on Indian students studying in the U.S. These are presented as signs of growing friction.
That's really concerning, real-world conflict.
Definitely. And to cap it off, the source includes a prediction from a European political analyst.
What's the prediction?
That if these trends, high immigration, perceived cultural shifts continue, we might see more political results like Brexit, or like the election of Donald Trump in the U.S., essentially more nationalist or populist surges.
So the source suggests these are potentially major political fault lines.
That's the underlying warning, yes.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. The core question running through this material seems to be, are these trends, as described, ultimately an economic plus for these Western countries, or are they viewed by some as a kind of cultural takeover?
Precisely. The source really presents those two possibilities in stark contrast. It uses the economic arguments, job displacement, wage issues, and the cultural ones, demographic shifts, changing norms, imported issues like caste to build its case.
It lays out a specific narrative using these examples and anecdotes.
Claims of economic harm on one side, claims of cultural erosion on the other.
And it leads off with a point for you, the listener, to really think about, based on the source's own ending.
Right. It asks you to consider the long game. If these trends continue as described in the material, what does that mean for national identity in places like the UK, Canada, Australia, the US?
What could the cultural landscape of, say, London or California look like decades down the line?
It's definitely food for thought, encouraging you to think through the complexities and the different facets of the arguments presented in these sources we've examined today.